Flight attendant refuses to give black woman a menu. She calls the CEO and gets them all fired. This is the story of how one woman's quiet strength unraveled a system of discrimination at 30,000 feet. Helen wasn't looking for a fight when she boarded that flight. She simply expected the respect she deserved. But what unfolded next would challenge the airline's very foundation, leading to a dramatic reckoning for those who thought their actions would go unnoticed. Want to know how one woman turned injustice into a powerful force for change? Stay tuned to find out, right here on Adam Alpha. Before we begin, where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. If you love inspiring stories of resilience and justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to Adam Alpha for more incredible tales. Your support helps us share these impactful stories with even more people. Now, let's get into it. The hum of the airport terminal buzzed around Helen as she adjusted the strap of her leather handbag on her shoulder. She stood tall, her figure wrapped in a tailored navy blue blazer and matching slacks, her presence exuding quiet confidence. Her natural curls framed her face like a crown, and her deep brown eyes scanned the boarding gate with a practiced calm. This wasn't her first flight, nor would it be her last, but there was something different about today. Something about the weight of the stairs she felt as she approached the gate. Can you guess what happened when Helen stepped onto that plane? Keep watching to see how this moment sparked a revolution, only on Adam Alpha. Helen could always sense the shift in energy the moment people saw her. Was it more than just another traveler? Was it the way she carried herself, or was it something she'd never been able to change, her skin, her heritage? Helen handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, who hesitated for the briefest moment. It was barely noticeable, but Helen had trained herself to catch these micro-expressions, the slight falter in a smile, the subtle narrowing of eyes. The agent recovered quickly, scanning the pass and offering a thin-lipped, professional smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Carter," the agent said, gesturing toward the jet bridge. Helen returned the smile, polite yet guarded. She'd learned to pick her battles. This wasn't one of them, at least, not yet. As she stepped onto the plane, Helen felt the cool burst of air conditioning. The first-class cabin stretched before her, pristine and modern, a place meant to exude luxury and comfort. Helen's eyes instinctively flicked to the faces of the passengers already seated. They ranged from seasoned business travelers engrossed in their tablets to a young couple speaking in hushed tones over champagne flutes. She made her way to seat 1A, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted aisle. A flight attendant, blonde and immaculately dressed, stepped aside to let her pass. The woman's eyes lingered on Helen for a moment too long. It wasn't curiosity, it was something colder, sharper. Helen felt it like a pinprick but kept her expression neutral, sliding gracefully into her seat. First class was supposed to be a sanctuary, but Helen could already feel the storm brewing, the glances, the whispers. She'd seen it all before. The quiet question that lingered unspoken in the air, does she belong here? Helen adjusted her seatbelt and placed her bag neatly at her feet. She reached for her phone, scrolling through emails to distract herself. The work never stopped. As a consultant specializing in corporate ethics and diversity initiatives, Helen's schedule was relentless, but it was a calling she took seriously. Her job wasn't just about policies, it was about holding the powerful accountable. A faint smile touched her lips as she thought about the meeting awaiting her at her destination. She wasn't just visiting, she was on her way to finalize a groundbreaking deal, a partnership that would set new standards for ethical business practices in the airline industry. It was a fitting coincidence, or perhaps fate, that she was flying on one of the very airlines she was about to reform. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. The blonde flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, distributing menus to each passenger with a rehearsed smile and a warm tone. Helen watched as the attendant approached her row, her anticipation growing. The attendant stopped at the seat directly across from Helen, handing a menu to the older gentleman seated there. She exchanged pleasantries with him, her voice honeyed and professional. Then, without so much as a glance at Helen, the attendant turned and walked away. Helen blinked, momentarily stunned. She glanced around the cabin, her gaze settling on the menus clutched in the hands of every other first-class passenger. Everyone except her. Her heart tightened, but she forced herself to take a steadying breath. This wasn't new. It wasn't shocking. But it still stung. "Excuse me," Helen called out, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant turned, her expression flickering with something Helen couldn't quite place: annoyance, fear? "Yes," the woman replied, her smile now brittle. "I believe you missed me," Helen said, her tone polite but edged with steel. She gestured to the menus. The attendant hesitated. "Oh, we're running low on copies," she said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "I'll see if I can find one for you." Helen nodded, her expression betraying none of the anger simmering beneath the surface. She watched as the attendant walked away without any real urgency, her smile fading the moment her back was turned. Helen leaned back in her seat, her fingers curling tightly around her phone. She wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't someone to be ignored or dismissed. But for now, she would wait. Let them think she was passive, complacent. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Helen stared at the soft glow of the overhead cabin light, the faint hum of the engines filling the air. Her mind was a whirlwind, yet outwardly she remained poised. She had spent years perfecting this: how to sit with dignity when every fiber of her being wanted to erupt. She wasn't new to microaggressions, to the quiet ways people tried to erase her presence. But no matter how many times it happened, the sting always felt fresh. The flight attendant didn't return with a menu. Minutes ticked by, stretching into what felt like hours. Helen occupied herself with her phone, scrolling through work emails and reading documents for the upcoming meeting. But her mind wasn't on the words. She could feel the disjointed energy of the cabin, the occasional glances cast her way by other passengers, their expressions varying from curiosity to discomfort. A soft chime signaled the start of meal service. Helen watched as the flight attendants rolled out the carts, their movements smooth and efficient. Plates were placed delicately before each passenger, the attendants' voices cheerful as they listed the menu options. The man seated across from her, a balding executive type in an ill-fitted suit, received his plate with a hearty laugh, exchanging banter with the blonde flight attendant. Helen's tray table remained folded away. No menu. No options. The same flight attendant finally reached her row. Helen straightened, her eyes meeting the woman's. There was no smile this time, no pretense of courtesy. The flight attendant leaned slightly, her voice low but clipped. "We only have one option left," she said. "Chicken or vegetarian?" Helen arched an eyebrow. "I wasn't given a menu," she replied evenly. "I'd like to know what's in the dishes before deciding." The flight attendant hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "The chicken has a cream sauce, and the vegetarian is pasta with vegetables." Helen's jaw tightened at the dismissive tone, the lack of detail that had been so readily provided to other passengers. "I'll take the chicken," she said, her voice steady, refusing to let her frustration show. The plate was placed before her with a thud, the movement just forceful enough to border on rude. The flight attendant didn't say another word before moving on. Helen glanced down at the plate, a hastily arranged meal that bore none of the elegance she'd seen on her neighbor's dish. She picked up her fork but couldn't bring herself to eat. Instead, she sat back, her gaze wandering around the cabin. A few passengers had noticed the exchange. Some quickly averted their eyes when Helen's gaze met theirs. One woman, seated a few rows back, offered a small, apologetic smile. It was fleeting, almost embarrassed, as if she didn't want to be caught showing sympathy. Helen set her fork down. She was no stranger to subtle humiliation, but this felt different. This wasn't just about a menu or a meal. It was about being deliberately made to feel small, out of place, unworthy. The quiet cruelty of it all simmered in her chest, but she wouldn't let them win. Not like this. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Helen glanced down at the screen, a message from one of her assistants confirming details for her meeting. She tapped out a quick response, her fingers moving with precision, masking the trembling that threatened to creep in. This meeting wasn't just important, it was pivotal. And now, the very airline she was about to partner with was giving her a front-row seat to everything that needed fixing. The meal service continued, the sound of clinking utensils and low murmurs filling the cabin. Helen's plate remained untouched. She stared out the window, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson. The beauty outside was a stark contrast to the tension that lingered within. Her thoughts were interrupted by the approach of another flight attendant, this one younger, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She seemed hesitant, her steps slower as she neared Helen's seat. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" she asked softly, her tone genuine. Helen turned to her, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't given the same level of service as the other passengers," she said, her words carefully measured. "Do you think that's okay?" The younger attendant looked flustered, her cheeks reddening. I'm sorry. I'll check on that." Helen nodded, her gaze unwavering. She watched as the woman retreated, disappearing into the galley. For a moment, the faintest flicker of satisfaction crossed Helen's face. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her point. But satisfaction wasn't enough, not yet. Moments later, the blonde flight attendant returned, her expression tight. She leaned down, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't appreciate being talked about to my colleagues," she said, her tone laced with condescension. "If there was an issue, you could have addressed it with me directly." Helen tilted her head, her calm demeanor never wavering. "I did," she replied. "You didn't seem interested in resolving it." The attendant straightened, clearly thrown off by Helen's composed response. Without another word, she walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Helen took a slow, steady breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she knew better than to react in anger. She had something far more powerful than outrage, she had leverage. Adjusting her blazer, Helen leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes, letting the hum of the engines drown out the cabin noise. This flight might be uncomfortable, but it would also be the catalyst for change. They didn't know who she was yet. But they would. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight settled into its cruising altitude. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, a blanket of stars faintly visible against the inky black sky. Helen remained motionless in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had the air of someone completely at ease, but inside, the storm churned. The blonde flight attendant passed her aisle again, this time without so much as a glance in Helen's direction. It wasn't just dismissal, it was a deliberate effort to erase her presence. Helen followed the attendant with her eyes, noting the overly polite exchanges she had with the other passengers. There was no question now, this was personal. Helen's fingers brushed against her phone, resting on the tray table. She didn't need to scroll through her contacts to find the number she was thinking of, it was memorized, etched into her mind from countless meetings and calls. A direct line to the CEO of the airline, someone she had worked closely with over the past year. She could call now, but she hesitated. Timing was everything. She didn't want to act out of frustration. No, this needed to be precise, calculated, a lesson that wouldn't be ignored or dismissed as a single incident. She needed to wait for the right moment to strike. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Excuse me, miss," the man seated across from her said hesitantly. Helen looked up, meeting his eyes. He was older, with a kind face etched with deep lines. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "I couldn't help but notice the way they've been treating you," he said, his tone cautious. "It's not right." Helen tilted her head, studying him. There was no malice in his words, only genuine concern. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but something in his earnest expression stopped her. "Thank you," she replied softly. "It's not the first time." The man's brow furrowed, his discomfort evident. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said, shaking his head. "It's disgraceful." Helen offered a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Disgraceful," she repeated. "Yes, it is." The conversation ended there, but the man's words lingered in Helen's mind. She wasn't alone in noticing the blatant discrimination, and that knowledge emboldened her resolve. She wasn't imagining it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was real, and it needed to be addressed. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the start of the in-flight entertainment. Helen barely heard it. Her focus was elsewhere, her mind already planning her next move. She picked up her phone, scrolling through her notes app. With each passing minute, she documented every detail of the interaction at timestamps, quotes, even the names on the name tag she had managed to glimpse. It wasn't just about her anymore. Helen knew that if she let this slide, it would happen again to someone else, someone who might not have the resources or the voice to fight back. She couldn't let that happen. Another flight attendant approached her row, this one male, with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Carter, is there anything I can assist you with?" he asked, his tone overly cheerful. Helen glanced at him, her expression unreadable. She had seen this tactic before: send someone new to defuse the situation without actually addressing the problem. It was a transparent attempt to placate her. "I'd like to speak to your lead flight attendant," she said calmly. The man blinked, his smile faltering. "I believe she's busy at the moment," he said, "but I'd be happy to assist." "I wasn't asking for your assistance," Helen interrupted, her tone firm but measured. "I'd like to speak to her. Now." The attendant's discomfort was palpable. He nodded quickly, retreating down the aisle without another word. Helen watched him go, her gaze steady. She wasn't going to be ignored anymore. Minutes passed before the blonde flight attendant returned, her expression tightly controlled. She stood next to Helen's seat, her posture stiff. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone clipped. Helen looked up at her, her calm demeanor unwavering. "Yes," she said simply. "There is." The attendant's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Helen gestured to the untouched plate on her tray table. "This isn't the standard of service I've come to expect from this airline," she said, "and your behavior has been disappointing." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The flight attendant's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, her voice icy, "but we do our best to accommodate all our passengers." Helen raised an eyebrow, her expression unimpressed. "Your best? Is that what you call skipping me during meal service, refusing to provide me with a menu, and then serving me something subpar without so much as an apology?" The attendant opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again. She glanced around, as if hoping for an escape. When none came, she muttered, "I'll make a note of your feedback." Helen leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "Do that," she said, "and make sure it reaches the right people." The flight attendant hurried away, her composure cracking. Helen leaned back in her seat, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. She reached for her phone again, her fingers hovering over the screen. The CEO's number stared back at her, a reminder of the power she held. She didn't press it yet. Timing was everything. For now, she would wait and let the tension build. Justice, after all, was best served cold. Helen's eyes remained fixed on the screen of her phone, the soft glow illuminating her composed face in the dimly lit cabin. She had reread her notes 3 times, ensuring every detail of her encounter was recorded precisely. Each word she typed felt like a step closer to justice, a quiet act of defiance against the indignity she had been subjected to. The flight continued, its quiet hum a blanket of calm masking the tension Helen could still feel simmering around her. The blonde flight attendant had vanished into the galley, her absence noticeable, as though she were avoiding further confrontation. Helen caught glimpses of her occasionally, whispering to another crew member while stealing furtive glances in her direction. Helen leaned back in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. She appeared relaxed, but her mind was sharp, processing every detail around her. She noticed the younger flight attendant, the one who had seemed genuinely concerned, moving about the cabin. The woman's gaze flickered toward Helen briefly before she turned away, her expression troubled. Helen sighed softly, turning her gaze to the window. The inky blackness of the night sky stretched endlessly, broken only by the faint blinking of the plane's wing lights. The vastness of the view was calming, a stark contrast to the suffocating energy within the cabin. Her thoughts drifted back to the purpose of her journey. The meeting waiting for her on the other side of this flight wasn't just about business, it was about change. Helen had worked tirelessly to build a reputation as an advocate for equity and ethics. She had sat in boardrooms filled with skepticism, faced the condescending smiles of executives who underestimated her, and yet she had always prevailed. This incident wasn't just personal, it was emblematic of the very issues she had dedicated her career to addressing. The sound of a cart rolling down the aisle drew her attention. Another flight attendant, this one a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, was offering drinks to the passengers. Helen observed him closely, noting the genuine warmth in his interactions with the others. When he reached her row, his demeanor faltered slightly, a hesitation that didn't escape her notice. "Would you like something to drink, ma'am?" he asked, his voice courteous but cautious. Helen studied him for a moment before responding. "Water, please." The man nodded, pouring her a glass with practiced precision. As he handed it to her, his eyes lingered on her face, as though searching for something. "I hope everything's all right," he said softly, almost as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. Helen met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "It will be," she replied, her tone calm but firm. The attendant nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He moved on, continuing his service, but Helen could feel the weight of his brief words. It was a subtle acknowledgement, a silent agreement that what she had experienced wasn't right. As she sipped her water, Helen felt a renewed sense of determination. The flight wasn't over yet, and neither was her fight. She placed the glass carefully on her tray table, her fingers brushing against her phone once more. Hours passed, and the cabin grew quieter as passengers settled into their seats for the night. The lights were dimmed further, casting the space in a soft, warm glow. Helen remained awake, her posture still poised. Sleep didn't come easily to her on flights, especially not after what had transpired. The blonde flight attendant emerged from the galley, her movements quick and deliberate as she checked on the other passengers. Helen watched her silently, noting the practiced smile that had returned to her face. The woman avoided Helen's row entirely, a clear indication that she had no intention of addressing the earlier confrontation. Helen leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. This wasn't avoidance, it was arrogance. The attendant didn't believe there would be consequences. She thought Helen's complaints would remain just that, words spoken and forgotten. But Helen wasn't the type to let things slide. She reached for her phone, scrolling to her contacts until the name she sought appeared on the screen: Jonathan Marks, CEO of the airline. Her thumb hovered over the call button for a moment before she tapped it, her decision made. The phone rang once, twice, before a familiar voice answered. "Helen," Jonathan said, his tone warm but slightly surprised. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you during your flight. Everything all right?" Helen's lips curved into a faint smile at the sound of his voice. They had worked together for years, building a professional relationship based on mutual respect. Jonathan wasn't perfect, but he had always been willing to listen and learn. "Jonathan," she began, her voice steady but tinged with steel, "I'm afraid we have a situation." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Go on," he said, his tone shifting to one of concern. Helen recounted the events of the flight in meticulous detail, her words measured but unyielding. She described the dismissive behavior, the microaggressions, and the blatant refusal of service. Jonathan listened intently, interrupting only to ask clarifying questions. By the time she finished, his voice had taken on a hardened edge. "This is unacceptable," he said, his frustration evident. "You have my word, Helen, this will be addressed immediately." Helen nodded, though he couldn't see it. "Good," she replied. "I'm not looking for apologies, Jonathan. I'm looking for action." "You'll have it," he promised. "I'll personally ensure that everyone involved is held accountable." Helen ended the call with a sense of satisfaction, but she knew this was just the beginning. Justice wasn't about words, it was about follow-through. And she would be there every step of the way to ensure that follow-through happened. As the plane continued its journey through the night, Helen leaned back in her seat, a quiet determination settling over her. The storm had begun, and there was no turning back. Helen ended the call and placed her phone gently on the tray table, her movements precise, almost deliberate. The faint hum of the engines filled the silence around her, a backdrop to her simmering thoughts. She wasn't angry, not in the volatile, unrestrained way people often expected. No, her anger was colder, sharper, honed over years of experience. It was the kind of anger that drove action, not outbursts. The cabin remained dim, the soft amber lights casting shadows across the seats. Most passengers were asleep now, their faces relaxed in quiet oblivion to the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. Helen, however, was wide awake, her mind racing, each thought a calculated step in the process of holding people accountable. This was more than a personal affront, it was a test of the very principles she fought to uphold. The faint sound of footsteps drew her attention. The younger flight attendant, the one with the dark hair and uncertain eyes, was making her way down the aisle again. Helen watched as she hesitated near her row, her steps faltering before she finally approached. "Ma'am," the attendant said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the plane. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Helen straightened in her seat, her gaze steady. "Yes," she replied, her tone polite but firm. I wanted to apologize," the woman said, her words tumbling out quickly, "for how you've been treated. It's not right, and I didn't know how to handle it." Helen studied her for a moment, noting the genuine remorse in her expression. The woman's apology wasn't rehearsed or perfunctory, it was raw, unpolished. Still, Helen knew an apology wasn't enough. "What's your name?" Helen asked, her voice measured. The attendant blinked, taken aback. "Megan," she said hesitantly. "Megan Hall." "Megan," Helen said, her tone softening slightly, "I appreciate your apology, but you need to understand something. Speaking up in moments like this isn't just about me, it's about setting a standard. If you see something wrong, you have a responsibility to address it." Megan nodded, her cheeks flushing. "You're right," she admitted. "I should have said something sooner." Helen leaned back, her gaze never leaving Megan's face. "It's not too late," she said simply, "but it takes more than words. Actions matter." Megan seemed to absorb this, her expression thoughtful. "I'll remember that," she said quietly. "And I'm sorry again. Truly." Helen gave a slight nod, signaling the end of the conversation. Megan lingered for a moment before retreating, her steps more purposeful this time. Helen watched her go, a faint flicker of hope stirring within her. Change, after all, often began with small, hesitant steps. As the hours stretched on, Helen's resolve only deepened. She watched the interactions between the other flight attendants and the passengers, each one a reminder of the disparity in treatment she had experienced. The blonde flight attendant remained a ghost, avoiding her row entirely. It was as if she hoped Helen would fade into the background, forgotten amidst the routine of the flight. But Helen was far from forgettable. Her thoughts were interrupted by a chime over the intercom. The captain's voice crackled through the speakers, announcing their descent into the destination city. The cabin stirred as passengers began to wake, stretching and shifting in their seats. Helen adjusted her blazer, her movements calm and deliberate. She was ready. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Helen's gaze remained fixed ahead. The blonde flight attendant finally reappeared, her demeanor as polished as ever, as she thanked passengers for flying with the airline. When she reached Helen's row, her smile faltered, the mask slipping just slightly. "Thank you for flying with us," she said, her tone flat, devoid of the warmth she had offered to others. Helen met her gaze, her expression cool. "I'll be sure to leave feedback," she said evenly, the words carrying an edge that made the attendant's cheeks flush. With that, Helen rose from her seat, gathering her belongings with quiet efficiency. She moved through the cabin with her head held high, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The eyes of the other passengers followed her, a mix of curiosity and respect in their gazes. As she stepped off the plane and into the terminal, Helen felt the weight of what was to come. This wasn't just about her, it was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no one else had to endure what she had. Justice wasn't just a concept, it was an action, a ripple effect that could transform systems and lives. Helen pulled out her phone and dialed Jonathan's number again. As the line connected, she stepped into the quiet of the terminal, her voice steady and resolute. "Jonathan," she said, "let's make this right." Helen stepped into the sleek, glass-walled arrivals lounge of the airport. The muted sounds of conversations, rolling luggage, and occasional laughter created a hum of normalcy around her. Yet, within her, a storm brooded, quiet but unrelenting. She clutched her phone tightly, her earlier conversation with Jonathan replaying in her mind. His promise to address the incident had been firm, but Helen knew better than to rely on words alone. Action was her domain, and she was prepared to see this through. The sharp click of her heels against the polished floor echoed as she walked with purpose toward the car waiting for her outside. She had texted her assistant, Maria, during the descent, giving her a brief account of the incident and instructions to prepare for a follow-up meeting with Jonathan's team. Helen didn't just want an apology, she wanted structural change. As the automatic doors parted and the cool night air swept over her, Helen spotted a black sedan parked at the curb. The driver, a tall man with a professional demeanor, stepped forward and opened the door for her. "Miss Carter," he greeted with a slight nod. Helen returned the gesture and slipped into the car's leather interior. She placed her bag beside her and exhaled slowly, her gaze fixed on the city lights flickering in the distance. The journey to her hotel was silent, giving her time to reflect on her next steps. The next morning, Helen sat at a corner table in the hotel's executive lounge, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. The soft rustle of newspapers and the quiet clink of cutlery filled the space. She had chosen this spot deliberately, away from prying eyes but with a clear view of the room. Her laptop lay open, her notes from the previous day meticulously organized into a detailed report. Maria, her assistant, arrived shortly after, her usual calm demeanor tinged with curiosity. She carried a folder, the edges neatly aligned, and a tablet tucked under her arm. "Morning, Helen," Maria said, sliding into the seat across from her. "I went through your notes. It's worse than I thought." Helen nodded, her expression neutral. "It's always worse when you experience it firsthand," she replied, "but this time, we have an opportunity to make it right." Maria opened the folder, revealing a printed summary of the airline's diversity and inclusion policies. "I cross-referenced their training manual with what you documented," she said. "There's a significant gap between policy and practice. Their so-called inclusivity training, it's superficial at best." Helen's gaze sharpened. "Then we'll address it at the root," she said. "This isn't just about retraining, it's about accountability, starting with that flight crew." Maria hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Do you think Jonathan will agree to disciplinary action? He might want to keep this quiet." Helen's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "He doesn't have a choice," she said. "This isn't just about bad press, it's about the integrity of his company. If he won't act, I will." Maria nodded, her confidence in Helen unwavering. "The meeting with his team is scheduled for 2 p.m., she said. "I'll prepare the materials." "Good," Helen said, closing her laptop. "Make sure they understand this isn't negotiable." At precisely 2 p.m., Helen entered the conference room at the airline's headquarters. The space was sleek and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Jonathan Marks stood near the head of the table, his expression carefully neutral. He was a tall man in his late 40s, his tailored suit emphasizing his commanding presence. "Helen," he greeted, stepping forward to shake her hand. "Thank you for coming. I've read your report. It's troubling, to say the least." Helen shook his hand, her grip firm. "I trust you've already begun addressing the issue," she said, taking her seat at the table. Jonathan hesitated, his gaze flickering to the other executives seated around the room. "We've initiated an internal review," he said. "The flight crew involved is being questioned as we speak." Helen's eyes narrowed. "Questioned isn't enough," she said, her tone firm. "This isn't an isolated incident, Jonathan. It's systemic. Your staff's behavior didn't just happen, it's the result of a culture that tolerates discrimination." One of the executives, a man with graying hair and a defensive posture, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Miss Carter, we have a strong track record of diversity." Helen cut him off with a sharp look. "A strong track record doesn't excuse complacency," she said. "Your policies might look good on paper, but they're meaningless if they're not enforced." The room fell silent. Jonathan leaned forward, his expression grave. "What do you propose?" he asked. Helen opened the folder Maria had prepared, sliding a document across the table. A comprehensive overhaul, she said. Mandatory training for all employees, a transparent reporting system for complaints, and disciplinary measures for those who fail to uphold your standards. Jonathan studied the document, his jaw tightening. This will be costly, he said. So is a lawsuit, Helen replied evenly, or a PR crisis. You can't afford to ignore this, Jonathan. Not if you want to stay ahead in this industry. The tension in the room was palpable. Helen didn't flinch, her gaze unwavering. Finally, Jonathan exhaled and nodded. You're right, he said. We'll implement your recommendations, and the flight crew involved will face immediate consequences. Helen inclined her head, her satisfaction tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Good, she said. I'll be following up to ensure progress. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan approached her as the other executives filed out, his expression softening. Helen, he said quietly, thank you for holding us accountable. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Helen met his gaze, her expression unreadable. It's not about ease, Jonathan, she said. It's about doing what's right. With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Justice, she knew, wasn't a single act, it was a continuous effort. And she wasn't done yet. Helen's steps echoed through the marble corridors of the airline's headquarters as she left the conference room. The air outside was crisp and cool, brushing against her skin as she stepped into the bustling city. Cars honked in the distance, and people moved in hurried strides, their lives seemingly untouched by the storm brewing within Helen's sphere. For most, today was just another day. For Helen, it was the start of a reckoning. Her driver was waiting by the curb, the black sedan's sleek body glinting under the afternoon sun. The door opened with a smooth, practiced motion, and Helen slid into the seat, setting her bag beside her. She didn't immediately tell the driver where to go. Instead, she sat in silence, her fingers drumming lightly on her knee as she stared out the window. Back to the hotel, Miss Carter, the driver asked, breaking the silence. Helen considered this for a moment, her gaze fixed on the skyline. Not yet, she said. Take me to the park on 9th. I need some air. The driver nodded without question, pulling into traffic with quiet efficiency. Helen leaned back, her thoughts racing. The meeting with Jonathan and his team had gone as expected, words of commitment, promises of change. But Helen knew promises could be hollow, their substance evaporating under the weight of convenience and corporate inertia. She needed more than words, she needed proof. The park was a small oasis amidst the urban sprawl, its paths winding through carefully manicured gardens and clusters of towering trees. Helen stepped out of the car, instructing the driver to wait. Her heels clicked softly against the stone pathway as she walked, the noise swallowed by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. She found a secluded bench near a small fountain, its water bubbling in a soothing rhythm. Sitting down, she pulled out her phone and opened her emails. Maria had already sent a follow-up, detailing next steps along with a summary of Jonathan's verbal commitments. Helen skimmed the message, her mind already working through the angles. Her gaze shifted to the fountain, watching the water ripple under the sunlight. The tranquility of the moment contrasted sharply with the turmoil she felt. It wasn't anger, she had processed that long ago. It was resolve, a steely determination that had carried her through countless battles. She glanced at her phone again and opened the contact list, scrolling through the names. She stopped at one, Chloe Bennett, the airline's chief human resources officer. Helen had worked with Chloe before, though their relationship was professional at best. Chloe had a reputation for being pragmatic, someone who prioritized the company's interests over individual concerns. Helen hesitated for a fraction of a second before dialing the number. The phone rang twice before Chloe's voice answered, clipped and efficient. Helen, Chloe said, I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. I like to move quickly, Helen replied, her tone calm but firm. I need an update on the internal review, specifically the flight crew. Chloe sighed, the sound of papers rustling in the background. It's still in progress, she said, but preliminary findings suggest a lack of adherence to our training protocols. We're addressing it. Helen's lips tightened. That's not enough, she said. You and I both know this isn't just about training, it's about accountability. What measures are you taking to ensure this doesn't happen again? There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Chloe spoke again, her voice was more measured. We're considering disciplinary action for the individuals involved, she said, and we're reviewing our hiring and training practices. It's going to take time, Helen. I understand that change isn't instantaneous, Helen said, her voice steady, but time isn't an excuse for inaction. I'll be watching closely, Chloe. This isn't going away. Chloe didn't respond immediately. When she did, her tone was subdued. Noted, she said. I'll keep you updated. Helen ended the call and leaned back against the bench, her eyes drifting to the fountain once more. She knew Chloe's reluctance stemmed from more than just logistics. Change was uncomfortable, especially when it threatened the status quo. But Helen wasn't here to make anyone comfortable. That evening, Helen sat in her hotel room, the city lights twinkling outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of traffic below. She had ordered room service but barely touched the meal, her mind too preoccupied to focus on food. Her laptop sat open on the desk, emails pouring in as news of the incident spread within the airline's upper ranks. A message from Jonathan caught her eye. She opened it, her gaze scanning the words quickly. Subject: Update on today's discussion. Helen, I wanted to personally thank you again for bringing this to our attention. We've initiated a full-scale review and are expediting the disciplinary process for those involved. I've also approved the implementation of your recommendations, effective immediately. You have my word that this will be handled with the utmost seriousness. Best regards, Jonathan Marks. Helen read the email twice, her expression impassive. It was a good start, but she knew better than to take it at face value. Follow-through was everything. Closing her laptop, Helen stood and walked to the window, the city stretching before her, vibrant and alive, a testament to resilience and growth. She crossed her arms, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. The air in the conference room was thick with tension as Helen took her seat at the long glass table. Across from her sat Jonathan Marks, his typically composed demeanor fraying at the edges. To his right was Chloe Bennett, the Chief Human Resources Officer, flipping through a series of documents with meticulous care. The remaining executives avoided Helen's gaze, their unease palpable. Helen placed her bag on the table and leaned back, her posture calm but commanding. I assume you've completed your review, she said, her voice even but laced with expectation. Jonathan exchanged a glance with Chloe before nodding. Yes, Helen. The investigation was thorough, and the findings are clear. Chloe will present the details. Chloe cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was about to say. After conducting interviews with the flight crew and reviewing past passenger complaints, we've identified a pattern of unprofessional behavior, particularly by the lead flight attendant, Catherine Ellis. She paused, her gaze shifting to Helen. Miss Ellis's actions on your flight were not only discriminatory but emblematic of a broader failure to uphold our values. Further investigation revealed multiple prior complaints against her, complaints that were mishandled by management. Helen's jaw tightened, her composure unshaken but her frustration evident. And what are the consequences? She asked, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Chloe straightened, her hands clasping the folder in front of her. Catherine Ellis has been terminated, effective immediately. Her blatant disregard for company policy and repeated offenses leave no room for remediation. The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with finality. Helen's gaze didn't waver. And the rest of the crew, she pressed. Chloe continued, her tone more measured. 2 members of the crew who supported or enabled her behavior have also been terminated. Their failure to intervene or report the incident made them complicit. A 3rd crew member, Megan Hall, has expressed genuine remorse and has voluntarily stepped forward to assist with developing a more inclusive training program. She will remain under probation while her contributions are evaluated. Helen allowed the silence to stretch, studying the room. She could see the discomfort etched on the executives' faces, the weight of accountability pressing down on them. And the systemic issues, she asked finally, her gaze shifting to Jonathan. Jonathan leaned forward, his voice firm. We've approved the immediate implementation of your recommendations. Every employee will undergo mandatory inclusivity training, starting with the leadership team. We're also overhauling our complaint handling system to ensure transparency and accountability. Helen nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. Good, she said, but this is just the beginning. Changing policies is one thing, changing culture is another. I'll be watching to make sure your actions match your words. Jonathan met her gaze, his discomfort giving way to sincerity. You have my word, Helen, he said. This will not happen again. As Helen left the headquarters, her mind lingered on the decisions made in that room. Catherine Ellis and her enablers had been held accountable, their arrogance and complacency leading to their downfall. It wasn't personal, it was justice. Their termination wasn't just about punishment, it was a signal to the entire organization that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. The city buzzed with life as Helen stepped into her waiting car. She glanced out the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. This battle was over, but the fight for justice was ongoing. Helen knew the road ahead would be long, but she had never been one to shy away from a challenge. As the car pulled away, Helen allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just a victory for her, it was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. And Helen, as always, was ready for the next fight. The day after the meeting felt lighter, somehow, though the gravity of what had transpired remained with Helen. Sitting in her hotel room, she gazed out at the sprawling cityscape, the sunlight reflecting off towering glass buildings. The events of the past few days played over in her mind, not as a burden, but as a reminder of what persistence and accountability could achieve. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Maria, the press release is live. I think you'll want to see this. Helen opened her laptop, navigating to the airline's official website. There it was, front and center, a formal statement from Jonathan Marks. The headline read, Commitment to Equity and Accountability, a message from the CEO. Helen clicked on the link, her eyes scanning the carefully worded paragraphs. In the statement, Jonathan acknowledged the incident without naming Helen directly, describing it as a failure to uphold the values and standards we promised to our customers. He outlined the immediate actions taken, including the termination of Catherine Ellis and other complicit crew members, the implementation of new inclusivity training, and a revamped process for handling complaints. The tone was clear, direct, and unflinching. It wasn't just damage control, it was a promise for change. Helen leaned back in her chair, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It wasn't perfect, no single action ever was, but it was progress. Later that afternoon, Helen met Maria for coffee at a quiet cafe near her hotel. Maria arrived with her usual efficiency, carrying a slim briefcase and a folder tucked under her arm. She slid into the chair across from Helen, her expression a mix of excitement and determination. You've seen the statement? Maria asked, setting the folder on the table. Helen nodded, sipping her coffee. I have. It's a good start. Maria opened the folder, revealing a draft of the airline's new inclusivity policy. Jonathan's team worked quickly on this, she said. They're implementing your recommendations almost verbatim. And they've asked for you to join the advisory board overseeing the changes. Helen raised an eyebrow. An advisory board? Maria nodded. They want to ensure the policies stick, and they know your name adds credibility. Helen considered this for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. She wasn't in this for accolades or titles, but if her involvement could push the changes further, she wasn't opposed. I'll accept, she said finally, but only if I have real influence. I won't be a figurehead. Maria smiled, clearly expecting that answer. I'll make sure the terms reflect that. The evening found Helen walking through the park on 9th Avenue, the same one she had visited after the initial meeting. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the trees and pathways. She stopped near the fountain, the sound of its bubbling water filling the quiet. A young black woman sat on a nearby bench, her expression thoughtful as she scrolled through her phone. Helen couldn't help but notice the determination in her posture, the quiet strength she recognized in herself. It reminded her why she fought these battles, why she pushed through the discomfort and resistance. As Helen walked past, the woman glanced up and smiled. "Hi," she said, her voice warm. Helen paused, returning the smile. "Hi. I saw your name in the news," the woman said, her tone a mix of awe and gratitude. "What you did with the airline, it's inspiring." "Thank you." Helen's chest tightened, a mix of pride and humility washing over her. "Thank you," she replied softly, "but there's still work to do." The woman nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. "There always is." Helen continued walking, her steps lighter now. The conversation stayed with her, a reminder of the ripple effect her actions could create. It wasn't just about policies or press releases, it was about people, about changing lives and perceptions. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Helen felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. She had fought for justice and won not just for herself, but for everyone who needed to see that change was possible. That's how Helen turned a moment of injustice into a powerful example of accountability and change. Her courage reminds us all that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. What do you think about Helen's story? Let me know in the comments below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Adam Alpha, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.